In his too short career, Lenny Breau developed a comprehensive approach to the guitar. It's a fingerstyle approach which we'll be applying to the 6th string, although later on Lenny did actually play the 7th string as well. My name is Paul Bordeaux, and welcome to The Guitar Style of Lenny Breau, presented by Segment Multimedia. We're going to be looking at Lenny's harmonics, his use of scales, his specialty chording, so feel free to use the stop and rewind button to stay with this approach as we go through Lenny's style. Lenny's use of harmonics was both original, and yet it wasn't just an effect. He integrated it a lot into his actual pieces. And what we're going to look at is his skill in making a harmonic, and learn to do that by starting at the 12th fret with our open strings, and we'll talk about the right hand first. Now in the right hand, we're going to generate the artificial harmonic by touching the 12th fret above the fret, but not pressing it down. And then with our right hand thumb, and you can see I'm using a thumb pick to do this. You don't need a thumb pick to do this, but this is what Lenny did. With the thumb, right hand thumb, we're going to pluck that string and then take away our first finger. So that's just the low E string open. Now I'm going to go to the A. Same thing. I'm not pressing down the notes. I'm just playing across the guitar. Now you can actually use, Lenny actually used a bit of his nail touching the string to create a crisper harmonic. So the first skill you want to develop is being able to just trace the strings using the harmonic, the new artificial harmonic. Now a good way to start learning this is to take chord progressions and organize the chords using harmonics, just in that simple fashion of playing across the 6 strings. The progression we're going to be doing starts with a G major 9th with a 6th. Going to be open strings E minor, 7th. We're going to bar the 5th fret for an A minor, 11. And then we're going to play an altered D chord, which has an A flat, a D, F sharp, C, E flat, A flat. So it's got a flat 9th and a flat 5th, a very loaded chord. Now first off, we're just going to take that G, and we're going to, instead of trying to count up 12 frets every time to create the harmonic, we're going to try to visualize the chord 1 octave higher. And all I'm doing here in the right hand is playing across the 6 strings, outlining that shape exactly 1 octave higher, which is what you want to do. Now I'm going to move to the 12th fret open, which corresponds to the open strings, which is our E minor. Now I'm going to go to the 5th fret, which of course is up an octave, and I'm visualizing straight across here again. And then I'm going to go to this altered A chord. Now that's a bit of a challenge. And there we have a progression. So instead of just playing random harmonics, we've got something going. That was a 1. In terms of harmony, 6, 2, 5. The next technique I want to use, and this is what one of Lenny's great innovations, was mixing his harmonic, his artificial harmonic, with a plucked string. And we're going to start again at the 12th fret. And this is like step 2. We're going to start by taking, there's a lot of debate about which finger Lenny used, his ring finger or his baby finger, to pluck the strings. And he did use his baby finger to pluck the string. You can do this. This is a choice you have to make with your technique. I'm going to use the ring finger, but Lenny did use the baby finger. It can be done both ways. And we're going to start by placing our ring finger on the open D string and simply plucking it. This will be followed by a harmonic on the 12th fret, which is artificial. And that's the skill. It can be done with your baby finger too. Now what you've got there is the interval of a second, and you get the two notes colliding, and it's hard to tell whether the note is actually a harmonic or a plucked note. And it's that magic that Lenny wanted to create. He didn't want you to know whether it was a plucked note or a harmonic. He wanted it to sound the same. Now I'm going to move into the next string, which is the open G string, and I'm going to pluck it with my ring finger, and then I'm going to do a harmonic on the 12th fret A string. So now I've got, and you can see how the notes ring together and how the intervals are fairly tightly packed. D to E is a second, whereas G to A also a second. So you've got some tightly packed intervals, and what's important here is all the notes are actually different. By avoiding duplicated notes, you're avoiding what Lenny thought of as musical dead spots. Now I'm going to move my ring finger into the B string, pluck it, and then followed by a harmonic on the D string. Ring finger down to the down to the high E string. I'm going to pluck that, and then the G. So the net effect is now, to help stabilize that, you can actually play the harmonic at the same time as the plucked string. And I'm moving across the guitar, plucking the harmonic and the open string at the same time. So let's take this pattern and let's apply this to our progression. I'm going to start with my G. I'm going to move to my E. I'm going to move to my A. I'm going to move to my altered D, which is going to be tougher. I'll do that one more time. This time I'm going to pluck the two notes at the same time. Now you can try different patterns. In this next pattern I'm going to do, again I'm using my ring finger to pluck the string, thumb and first finger, in a kind of angle like that. And I keep my ring finger across from my thumb. We're going to go across and back. So here we go. Pluck note, harmonic, pluck note, harmonic, pluck note, harmonic. Once we hit that high A harmonic there, we're going to go back down. Now another thing you can try, you'll notice that in the harmonic packages, most of the notes are different. But one of the things you can try is, have you got any fingers left to do a little bit of hammering on or pulling off? If we examine our G chord for a moment, there is a note available on the high E string with our baby fingers of the left hand, baby finger of the left hand, which is a G note. Now we can hammer on that note, and this is something else that Lenny did. So we have a new pattern here. We start with our pluck, harmonic, pluck, harmonic, pluck, harmonic. Now once I pluck that F sharp note, I'm going to hammer on a G note. So I get, and you'll notice that I've got two notes on that high E string, followed by a harmonic, followed by that G note again, and I'm going to pull it off. On that lovely open E, I can use an F sharp note in my left hand, hammering it on. Once I do the harmonic on the G, I can hammer on E to F sharp. I'm going to use a B note on this A minor, a high B note. I'm going to hammer into it. Once I hit that, when I hit this D, I'm going to hammer on from an A flat to a B flat. Another innovation that Lenny used was he took conventional chord voicings. I'm going to take the example of an A minor here. And what he did is he placed the harmonic in the bass. At the same time, he used his remaining 3 fingers of his right hand, his middle, his ring, and his index, to pull the chord at the very same time that he was creating the harmonic. What this does is it throws the octave of the bass note up. So for example, in the A minor 7th, the next note in the chord is a G. But when you play them, it's that effect of playing the 2 notes again, only this time the second note will be played with your second finger. Now in his playing, he often used it in turnarounds. So if we take a simple turnaround in G, G major 7th, I'm going to create the harmonic in the bass note. I'm going to go to an E7 sharp 9, again, harmonic in the bass note. A minor 7th, harmonic in the bass note. D7 sharp 9. So it's a nice effect, and something that just pops out while Lenny's playing sometimes. So I would include that in your techniques with harmonics. A further development, a further building on this idea of using harmonics in your playing is to actually learn to mix your open strings or closed strings, whatever the case, with harmonics and actually play a scale. Now the scale I'm going to use for this to demonstrate is just a G major scale, and I'm going to do it in a descending and ascending fashion. We're going to start by creating a harmonic on the 12th fret open G string. That's our first note of the scale. Now we'll have our 3rd finger in the left hand prepared on the F sharp, and we're going to pluck that with our 3rd finger on the right hand and then pull it off. So now we've got G, F sharp, pull off to E, which is a descending of the G. We're going to follow this with a harmonic, artificial harmonic on the open D string, pluck note on a C on the 1st fret there, pulling off to open B. So now we've got G, F sharp, E, D, C, B. I'll just do that. This will be followed by an open A string, and then finally a plucked G. So let's go through that again slow. Harmonic, plucked note, pull off, harmonic D, not a very good one there, plucked C, pull off, harmonic A, pull off G. Sorry, harmonic A, open G. Here's what it sounds like. Now, simple major scales are not the only ones that Lenny did this with. In fact, I'll demonstrate one more here. This is actually a G melodic minor. And I'm going to start on the flat 3rd, which is B flat, as a harmonic. I'll use that as a 2 chord, and it can even be used as a tonic 1. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't include the flat 5 turnaround. This is one of Lenny's favorite turnarounds that he used, and you can submit it to harmonics as well. So first, we're just going to look at the key of G, and we're going to do a flat 5 turnaround. Normally, your turnaround in G is 1, 6, 2, 5, which is G major, E dominant usually, A minor, D dominant. Now, for the E dominant, instead of playing E dominant, we're going to play the flat 5 of E, which is B flat major. And we're going to use the same quality of chord. We're going to start with a G. That's that G ninth, major ninth with the 6th, up to B flat. We're going to reach in and play E flat, Lydian. Now, that E flat is acting as a flat 5 of the 2 chord. And again, Lenny is using a quality that is major instead of the traditional minor sound. And of course, the flat 5 of the D, which is A flat. So in summary, you're getting G, B flat, E flat. Certainly one of the turnarounds that was his favorite. And you can use your harmonic patterns, artificial harmonic patterns, to play these. Certainly one of the most exciting parts of Lenny's playing is his use of essential tones to create a comping style while he's carrying a melody over top with his right hand. I mean, this is just amazing. I don't think anybody has ever done this before on the guitar. And it's a very pianistic approach in that the comping patterns and the punctuation going on in a piano player's left hand, Lenny is duplicating here with his right hand fingers while he's carrying tunes over top. It's a truly phenomenal development for guitar stylists, and it's a fingerstyle approach. You can't really do it any other way. And what we're going to do is take a couple of musical ideas. We're going to have to talk a little bit about theory here and take a look at what Lenny, close-up look at what Lenny was doing. Okay. The basic theory behind it is quite simple, and in that sense, Lenny was very proper. He was using very correct theory to do this, and applying it to the guitar was the unusual thing that occurred to him. So, basically speaking, jazz is tonal. You're using major chords, minor chords, dominant chords. Now, in the dominant chords, major chords, minor chords, they all have what are called essential notes. These are what Lenny called comp chords. Essential notes are the smallest interval that you can reduce the chord to so that it still sounds like the chord. For example, the thirds and the sevenths of a major chord, a minor chord, or a dominant chord are the essential tones. We're going to take a B-flat blues and we're going to reduce them to essential tones. Now the chord B-flat 7 can be reduced to 2 notes. Now the notes are not a chord, it's just an interval. It suggests a chord though. And the 2 notes are the third, which is D, and the flat 7, which is A flat. Now for our purposes, I'm locating it on the A and D strings. This can be done on any string set, but we're starting on these 2 strings so that we have 3 strings available to us for individual noting. Okay, so I'm going to play through a very simple 12-bar blues, which will be in your booklet, just using the essential tones. These are the essential tones of B-flat, B-flat 7. And we're going to play 4 beats to the bar. E flat 7 essential. Now if I stop there for a second, you see that the position of the essentials reverses. The flat 7 here is the lower note, and the third G is the higher note. So again, bar of B flat 7, bar of E flat, 2 bars of B flat, just sitting on those essential notes. In my right hand, I'm using my thumb and my index. Back to B flat. I'm going to go up to G 7th essential, C 7 essential, F essential, B flat essential, F 7 essential. So you can see the notes are always on the same 2 strings. And because we're using dominant essential tones, they all have the same function. So I want to reiterate here for a moment how important it is to identify the thirds and the sevenths of your chords. These are the essential tones, and there's no getting around that. We have to find out where they are on the guitar in order to do this. Now, talking about the B flat for a moment, we're used to seeing B flat in that big bar chord form, but now we're reducing it to just the third, D, and the flat 7, A flat. And you'll notice that in the left hand here, I'm using my middle 2 fingers to do it. This gives me 2 fingers free to play the B flat blues scale. Now when my chords change, I have to select the appropriate third and seventh of that chord of the moment. And still, I'm going to, when I'm on these strings, I'm only going to use the middle 2 fingers to play those 2 notes. In the right hand, I'm using my thumb and my index to play that. Now, here's our next challenge, and it's a little bit difficult if you haven't done this before. We're going to put a scale over top of this 2-note package, this 2-note interval of an uneven fourth, which are the essential notes of B flat 7th. And the scale we're going to put over it is pretty simple. It's the blues scale of B flat. But we'll be playing it a whole new way, just with our baby finger and our index finger. So this is pretty hard to do if you haven't done it before, because there's a lot of smushing of the fingers as they change position. It may also give you a fingering you hadn't used before, but it's very important to understand that if you want to get that style that Lenny was doing, there's no way around it. A good way to organize it is to take a regular beat and using one of your fingers from the right hand, say the middle finger, we're going to play the scale of B flat. Right with each beat. The other attack that is good is the off the beat attack. Of course, when you put those together, you get the whole scale. This has to be done on each note, each grouping of your B flat blues. So when I go to E flat, and it's a bit hard, and same for the G here. Here's the C. Now you notice there on that F, I resorted to a bar fingering. When it's convenient, don't be troubled by changing your fingering to the first finger and the middle finger, because it's something that Lenny did all the time. You don't want to have a torture test here. You do want to be comfortable. So if you do refinger on occasion, that's fine, as long as you know you're doing that and realize that you still have to use 2 fingers to get those dominant packages. So what I'm going to do now is actually demonstrate with a little blues that I call Breau's Blues. Now that we've got a basic location on the blues, we can move to that the part that actually gets a little bit fun, where you're punctuating with these rather than carrying the full 4 beats, which is like a workout for location purposes. Now I'm going to just play freely and comp on these 2-note packages through a blues. So you can see that I was pretty confident about where I was playing all the time, and that comes from knowing exactly which chord is happening at that moment. You might also see that while I'm doing these little punctuations, sometimes I was bending my finger down and maybe picking up an extra harmony, but trying to generate it from the blues scale or appropriate harmony of the moment. So I think that's a very fun thing. Now that we're aware that essential tones can be used in this fashion that Lenny created, we're going to take a closer look at progression now. A good way to start dealing with these essential tones is to take basic key movements, basic progressions in key, and refinger them using this 2-note method. It completely changes the way your fingerboard looks. If you haven't done this before, there's a lot of redrawing of the neck as you learn to identify these 2-note packages all over the guitar. A good way to organize it is to take progressions and to start to see how it sits on your guitar. We're going to begin with the key of G major, and I'm going to take a simple 2-5-1 progression, and I'm going to find it on the A and D strings. Now the 2 chord of the key of G is A minor. The flat 3rd is C, the flat 7th is G. So as a general rule, I'm going to use my middle 2 fingers, whenever possible, to play the 2-note package, to play the comp chord, to play what I call the essential tones. There's our essential tones of A minor. It's at the 10th fret. I'm using my 2nd finger and my ring finger in the left hand, and I'm using the thumb and the 1st finger in the right hand. Now watch this. The next chord is D7th. The essential notes of D7th are F sharp and C. All I have to do is move one of my fingers 1 fret, and I've got essential D7th. Just listen to that. So you can't get much closer voice leading than that. That's an excellent little package. Now you may not be used to hearing, because I mean this is just really the interval of a 4th, so it's sort of vague and sticking out in space there. If you want to hear the bass note, you can actually tape the bass note and play against it. You can actually try to listen for it here. Here I'm going to relocate the package on the middle 2 strings and play a bass note. There's your traditional bass note. And here's the essential tone package. Now here's the D, essential, D with the bass note. So these intervals are on different string sets. Now the essential G will be F sharp and B. And look at that tight package. It's all 1 fret movements. And we've summarized a whole progression. 2, 5, 1. Essential A minor, essential D7th, essential G major. Traditionally, you might hear something like so you have to sort of learn to hear a new way. However, this leaves us 2 fingers, and we're able to do some scale work around these notes. For beat organization, when you're doing a 2-5-1, it's very good to do a bar of A minor, a bar of the D7 essential, 2 bars of the G. give you some breathing space there. Now once I'm pretty comfortable where this is, I can start to examine my G major scale in the same area. You see I've got the open G, the open B, and the open E. I've got 3 strings left I can reach for. I'm going to take the G scale, which is right here, but I'm going to play it with these whole new fingerings. I'm reaching back, getting a D note, E note, F sharp note, G note, A note, B, C, D, E. I can get right up to E. I suppose with big stretching I can get that high. Now follow the same procedure as with the blues, which is take on the beat sounds and experiment with them. A really good thing to do is maybe work one string at first. Like I'm just going to work the high E string here, and I've got B, C, D, and E available to me. Just on the beat structures. One thing that's happening harmonically, and something which Lenny was extremely aware of, is that as you change your essential functions, you're also changing the nature of the harmony over top. Let's take this D note as an example. When I play that D note against the A minor 7, it's actually 11th I'm playing. That D is a 4th. Up an octave it's an 11th. So it's a very colorful note. When I switch my essential package to D, the note becomes a root. And when I switch to G, the note becomes a 5th. This knowledge of function is critical if you're going to play in this style. In fact, in any jazz style, function is everything, because the same note, same name note, has different functions depending on the harmonic context. So a good way to learn it is to take each note of the scale and see what your harmonic content is. If I take the C on the A minor, I have a 3rd. When it goes to the D, I've got a flat 7. And when I go to the G, I've got a sus. So now I'm just going to play some regulated beats, working that high E string. Two bars. Very aware of function here. Now, once we know that, that function is everything, and it's something that Lenny was very skilled at, we can be a little bit freer with it. There's something known as approach notes in jazz. You'll hear little chromatics in there. And don't be afraid of using some of those chromatic in-between notes, because as long as you're aware of function and beat placement, I wouldn't place these in really strong beat positions or rest on these notes, these chromatic notes that are available. They're generally called chromatic neighbors, and they're semitones that are in between your scale tones. So if you're being quite harmonically hygienic about this, you'll go through and measure each note quality against each essential tone package. So when I'm on the A minor, I know that if I play the D here, I've got a 11th, here's a 5th, here's a 6th, flat 7, root, 9th, flat 3rd, 4th, 5th. And I know that, so when I'm putting in chromatics, I'm trying to come back to stable tonal areas. Now before you get too far down the road of integrating that scale work with your essential tones, it's a very good idea just to get comfortable with the essential tones. And a good way to do that would be to sequence through some 2/5s. And you can use the opportunity of sequencing through 2/5s in order to do, once you're comfortable, in order to do a little bit of harmonic homework. So here I'm going to take a 2-5-1 in the key of G again, with that same beat structure. Now I'm going to move into the key of F, which drops the whole thing. From our original key, it's 2 frets lower. I'm in the key of F now. I'm going to go in the key of E flat. That's the 2. That's the 5. That's the 1 of E flat. Now I'm going to go into key of D flat. There's the 2 of D flat. And you can see how comfortably this cycles down the guitar. And you can keep going. I'm going to go back to G for a moment here, and I'm going to try some harmonic content. Notice here that I took my essential A package and I froze in a note, in this case a D note, which is the 11th. On my essential D package, I froze in an E note, which turns into a 9th. And back on my G here, put an F sharp in, which is, I'm actually doubling the 7th. These notes from the scale can be frozen into your 2-note packages to create interesting new harmonies. And when you do this, though, you have to be aware of what quality you're putting in, because you've got to understand, you've got to be able to control the harmony. If you're playing from the scale, you're generally not going to go wrong. But once you get into more advanced scales, into altered scales and whatnot, you have to be a lot more careful about which notes you're putting in. Now, in summary, I think there's a couple of good sequences that you can use to ground yourself in the 2/5s. One of them, which was the one I was just discussing, which is just going down in whole steps through different keys. Another progression that Lenny was really fond of was the 1-6-2-5 and the 3-6-2-5. So we're going to look at that in the key of G for a moment, again just using these 2-note packages. 4 beats on the G, which is our 1. That's essential. 4 beats on an E, which is our 6th chord. Now you notice I'm using a dominant package here. The 3rd is G sharp, the flat 7 is D. So I'm using something called a secondary dominant instead of a straight 6th chord to create some movement to go to the A minor. So starting on G again, 4 beats. 4 beats on that E7th, A minor, 4 beats on the D7th. And you see the shapes rhyme. There's my uneven 5th there, back to a normal 4th here, uneven 5th there. Now I got to use that. And I'm working sort of just one string at a time I'm working. If you want to organize this into a progression, a good example is 3-6-2-5-1-6-2-5. 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, 6, 2, 5. When dealing with this style of music that Lenny developed, decisions have to be made. And one of the decisions that's very important to a fingerstyle guitarist is how to develop a single note approach. We're going to examine some of the basic strokes that Lenny used in his single note approach, plus some of the scale selections. As our initial example, I'm going to use a C major scale. Now, one of the basic strokes that Lenny used was just his thumb. If I play through a C major scale with just my thumb pick, I can hold it like a pick, or I can play freely from my thumb muscle. It's a good stroke. It's a strong melodic stroke. It could be used for slower passages. His utility stroke that Lenny used was a simple thumb 1. And I'm going to play through a C scale going thumb stroke, index finger stroke. And in my right hand, I've got like a little X formed in my fingers. It's a good utility stroke. And it's got that nice alternating characteristic which lends itself well to scale work. Now we get, that will handle the slower speeds, and now Lenny developed a stroke really coming out of a tradition, a country tradition of using the roll and transplanting the roll to one string. Now traditionally, and this comes out of the country music, the music of Chet Atkins, the banjo, traditionally a good fingerstyle approach to play 3 notes was thumb 1, 2. Now if we take just a normal C chord, then play it with thumb 1, 2. That's known as a roll. Now what Lenny did, really under the influence of Chet Atkins, was to transport that stroke to 1 string instead of going across 3 strings. If we do that, and I'm going to take a C scale to do it again, thumb 1, 2. Now Lenny modified it for his own comfort to a 2-1 thumb, a middle index thumb. One of the things that emerges from this is that he had to relocate his scales into 3-note groupings so that his roll could go quickly across the strings. So there he had covered slow playing, medium playing, and up-tempo playing. However, it's quite a bit of work for the guitarist because he has to refinger his scales so that you get 3 notes on a string. However, you get the roll. Now what I'm going to do in order to expedite this is take the scale of C all over the guitar and convert it to 3 notes per string. This can be done with any scale. It can be done with altered scales. Most of the scales that are in use can be recast in this kind of fingering. Of course, when you're using pentatonic scales, 5-note scales, 6-note scales, you don't really have those groupings. But for the 7-note and 8-note scales, you do. So what I'm going to do is take the distinguish between ascending and descending, which is what Lenny did. For his ascending stroke, he used middle, index, thumb. I'm just going to play through a C scale now, middle, index, thumb, and you'll see in the booklet that I'm putting 3 notes on each string. Now for backwards, we're going to go thumb, 2, 1, thumb, 2, 1. Now in the heat of playing, these strokes may get mixed up a bit, and that's not really important at this point because once you're following the flow of the music, you're just going to play. However, for good, clean practice, stick to those basic strokes. I'm going to play through the C scale in all positions using these 3-note groupings, beginning at the low F here and ending up high G. The next step in using the roll, instead of on one string, we're going to go back now to this across 3 strings. And we're going to take the scale of C and we're going to harmonize it in 4 parts. In other words, the basic 7th chords of the key. So you're going to get C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, etc., as you'll see in your booklet. And what Lenny did for this, he had quite a powerful baby finger. So if I take a C major 7th for a moment and play C, E, G, hammer to B. He had quite a strong hammer and quite a strong pull. So when he was playing backwards. Myself, I tend to play the note, but be aware that Lenny had enormous strength in his baby finger of his left hand and could pull. So I'm going to go through the C scale in 4 parts using the roll. And backwards. A little pulling there. Lenny was quite adept at this and very good at playing these at very rapid speeds. For our purposes, start by learning the harmonized scale up and down. That's what he himself recommended. The other component, which is quite fascinating that he used, was to take these arpeggios and play across the guitar backwards in fourths. In other words, the arpeggios themselves are a fourth apart. Now this can be done in each of the positions that you just played through. I'm going to demonstrate that now using that C starting point. Now a fourth underneath the chord of C in the scale of C is G7. Now the counter is the high note. B is the high note here. It's the 7th of the chord. And that becomes our counter. So the next note, the next arpeggio begins a fourth beneath that B. And that will give us the G7. So it's all 7s on the high note. And one of the modifications that Lenny liked to use was he liked to start the arpeggio a fourth below that high note. So if you start with an F, you get that kind of effect. Very, very common in Lenny's playing. So the same way that we're able to play the arpeggios in a sequential fashion up and down the neck, you can now start practicing across the neck. So you get this whole range of arpeggios in each position here. which you can play bidirectionally. You can play them ascending and descending. Lenny was very fond of these. If you've done your homework, you'll be able to determine which chord is a fourth beneath. And this again will be illustrated in your booklet. I will recommend some basic scale patterns that Lenny did use as well. One of his favorite patterns was to play a group of 3 notes. And again, this sits well with our roll and also with just thumb 1, which I'll do right here, and the groupings of 3. To play 3 notes and then return to the first note. And he takes that pattern and circulates it through the scale. Same descending. So that gives you a nice little pattern. What is nice about it is, rhythmically speaking, it's half a bar long. So 2 patterns, 2 groupings, gives you a full bar. And you don't have to be real strict about it, but it's good as a departure point for your soloing. So to think I'm either going to be playing arpeggio, or now I have this pattern of a 3-note grouping that I'm going to use as my starting point all the time for my soloing. The second component that Lenny really enjoyed was thirds, descending and ascending, which is when you play a note of the scale, you play up a third, then you play the next note of the scale, up a third, Lenny could do it very quickly, very cleanly, obviously a lot of hours behind that kind of discipline. Well, now we come to one of the more exciting parts of Lenny's playing, which is his scale selections over chord changes. We're going to use the 1-6-2-5 as our example again, and the 1 in this case is going to be C, the 6 is going to be A7, we're converting it to dominant, truly a secondary dominant, going to a D minor 7, which is the 2, going to G7, which is our dominant chord back to C. So it's this progression: C major 7th, A 7th, D minor 7th, and G 7th. Please note that the A 7th is a secondary dominant chord in the key of C. It's actually the dominant of D minor. And the G 7th, of course, is the natural dominant of the C chord. Now for the C chord, scale selections that Lenny made were the major scale. Now we've already prepared the major scale with some patterns and with our 3-note groupings and arpeggios. Another scale that Lenny liked to use on this tonic chord is the Lydian, which has a more haunting sound. And he will use that though. However, when we hit the A 7th, which is the secondary dominant chord of the key of C, truly the 5 chord of D minor, this is where we start to get some interesting scale selections. And what I'm going to do is enumerate the scale selections that Lenny made on dominant chords. So what I'm saying for the 6-7 chord, which is A 7th, is also going to hold true for the 5-7 chord, G 7. For the 1 chord, C major or C Lydian. For the 2 chord, just D Dorian at this point. Okay, once we hit that A, one of the scales that Lenny really liked was something called the diminished whole tone scale. Now he showed me this scale and explained to me that it's a mixture of diminished and whole tone. It also has other names, as I found out later. It's known as a super-Locrian mode. It's known as a melodic minor substitute scale. But when Lenny explained it to me, he explained it as a diminished whole tone scale. Now if we take A as our counter, we're going to go through quite a fingering here of this scale. It begins, first finger on the A, second finger on the B flat. Now B flat's a flat 9 in terms of A. Then we move to a C note, which is a sharp 9 when you're on a dominant chord. It's not a minor third, it's a sharp 9. This portion, moving to the next note, C sharp. See how I go to the next string there? So I'm trying to keep a little bit of a grouping thing there. That note, the third, when you take it from the A, has the same structure as conventional semitone diminished scales. So you've got semitone, whole tone, and then you've got your semitone again. That's the first half of the scale. The second half of the scale starts with this E flat and just goes whole tone. So we go from the E flat to the F, from the F to the G to the A. So in one octave, the first tetrachord, the first 4 notes, are diminished, and the next 4 notes, beginning a whole step away, are whole tones apart. Now, if you're really going to do your homework on this, you can use your essential tones, or you can use your straight knowledge of function to understand what effect you're getting with the scale. For example, a flat 9, sharp 9, normal third, flat 5th, sharp 5th, flat 7th, tonic. You can see you've got your essential tones there represented. You've got no stable 5th. There's no normal 5th in a diminished whole tone scale. There's also no normal 9th. So this scale, in a broad sense, falls into what's called an altered category. So whenever you see in books A altered, this scale would certainly do it. You are permitted to add any of these notes into your chord. And the way that, a good way to organize it is to take your essential tones, and again I have to go through a refingering process here. And suddenly you've got all these delicious harmonies available to you that are just crying out for resolution. They're crying out to go to that D minor, to move up a 4th. So this is an excellent scale to use when you're moving up a 4th. It's an altered dominant scale. It's the diminished whole tone scale. So now I'm going to put it into a 2-octave fingering, and then I'm going to convert it to 3-note groupings. Here's our second octave. You can see, if you know a B-flat melodic minor, it's the very same fingering, only you're starting on A. If I convert to 3-note groupings, you can see how when I get on the high strings there, flat 9, sharp 9, regular third, how I have to reach and scrunch. But what a delicious scale. One of Lenny's favorites. Now I'm just going to play from C to that A7, but using the altered scale, and you can hear some of the effect. Look at that, you right? Back in Dorian. Now here I'm using the the diminished whole tone scale on the G. This turns out to be the same as A-flat melodic minor. It's also known as G superlocrian or G diminished whole tone. But listen to the differences in the sounds now. Now we've got a lot of tension when we move to D minor. We've got a lot of tension when we move back to C. So that was one of Lenny's favorite ways to generate tension. And he did this also with his essential tones. And I'm going to do that now in C. So this flat 9 that you're hearing on the dominant chords, I'm going to isolate the A for a moment. You see I've got my essential tone package plus that flat 9. That flat 9 in my mind is emanating from the diminished whole tone scale. Same on the G. So there's essential C. So it's like formalizing those chromatics that you were just doing as neighbor tones before, now are being used on the dominant chords to create a lot of tension and give you more possibilities to resolve into the chord. Because the scale standing alone, if I play that A scale, it's still waiting to go to a solid note, and the note that it's looking for is one of the notes in D minor. Settles it down. So there, just from moving from that C sharp, which is the third of the diminished whole tone, moving to the D root, I'm safe. There are so many resolution possibilities that it would just take a catalog of licks to go through it. But realize, harmonically, you're moving from one chord to another chord. Each chord is acting as its own little tonal center. These altered dominants are giving the tension. Now let's move to the second scale selection, which is the first of our symmetrical scales. It is the diminished scale. Now there's two kinds of diminished scales, one which begins with a half step and one which begins with a whole step. For the purposes of substitution here, you use the A half step diminished. So it begins the same as the diminished whole tone, but it does change. If we start the same way, I've got root, flat 9, sharp 9. Remember, function is everything. Sliding up to my third there. On the next string, I have flat 5, and lo and behold, I have a normal fifth. So that's a difference from the diminished whole tone. Sometimes the only time you can notice a difference is when you compare the scales. Now our next note is a 6th or a 13th. And then we got the flat 7th and the root. So sounding like this. Now you notice we have an extra note in this scale. If you actually count the different notes, you have 8 notes before it actually repeats. That's why it's known as a symmetrical scale, because you have 8 notes. Deliciously vague scale. There's all sorts of wonderful arpeggios and packages in there, triadic packages that are available to you. Wonderful stuff. It's like you can't play a wrong note with a diminished scale. So that we've got, but the difference when you compare it to your diminished whole tone is that you have a stable fifth and you have a 6th. So you have a bit of color. It has more stability in a way than the diminished whole tone. The diminished whole tone, you're definitely going to sound like you've stepped outside. And again, you can submit, you can use these groupings, these notes of the diminished scale against your essential tone packages. You can see it's a lot of work to get used to these dominant selections, but it's well worth it for generating the tension that you need to create movement from one chord to another chord. The next scale I wanted to talk about is a 6-note scale, and this is another scale that Lenny quite liked. It's called a whole tone scale, and it's symmetrical, but just with 6 notes, not with 8 notes. So for grouping purposes, the two symmetrical scales we've been discussing, one is the half-step diminished, substituting on the dominant. This next one is the whole tone scale. So one is 6 notes, the other is 8 notes. Okay, here's a whole tone on the chord A. There's the 6 different notes. A, root, B, which is the 9th or the 2nd, C sharp, which is the 3rd. There's the flat 5th, sharp 5th, flat 7. And that's the scale, and it repeats. And there's a very comfortable fingering that I was shown. Which is really just using the first finger and the third finger to travel across. And if we look at that, that again should be measured against your A dominant to see what effect you're having. Because again, you've got uneven fifths in this, so it's a little bit outside sounding, not as stable as the diminished scale, which has a fifth. But you'll see each of these scales, the diminished whole tone, the diminished half-step substitute, the whole tone scale itself, all of them contain the essential notes of A, that reduction of the 3rd and the flat 7. So normally we're used to thinking of the chord of A7th as living in the D minor scale or living in the D major scale. But now we're finding out it does live in other scales as well. And Lenny used these scales to generate interest. Now we're going to move to a little bit more outside scale. Not used as much for moving up a fourth, but certainly is used. And it's called a Lydian dominant scale. One of the other scales that the chord A7 lives in, if you do a survey of all these different basic scales, is the scale of E melodic minor, which I'm just going to play for a moment just to get your ear in. Now it really has, when you play it against A is the 4th of E. Therefore they call A the Lydian spot in E minor. And it's dominant because the net effect of the scale is dominant. But this Lydian dominant scale is good for use on isolated dominant chords, and it's just one of the scales that Lenny used. And I'm going to play through it now. It starts with the root. Notice we've got a normal second there. Don't see that too often. And then we've got the 3rd, and there it is, the flat 5. The sharp 11, that's the dominant, that's the Lydian. Then we got a 5th, 6th, flat 7. So you still get the essential tritone notes, but now you've got yet a different coloration. When you put these notes into your essential packages, you get a different flavor. Something Lenny liked quite a bit is that little riff. So in summary, the one thing in common, again, is that you have the essential notes represented in all these different scales, and Lenny used all these scales when he was dealing with dominant chords to create interest. Now, to run through them again briefly, you've got the diminished whole tone scale. That's 2 octaves there. You've got the half step diminished. You got the whole tone. And you've got the Lydian dominant. So, this same principle can be applied to your G dominant chord as well. So there's a lot of homework there, and I recommend that you really explore that diminished whole tone because it was a scale that Lenny really favored. So now I'll go back to my progression, and I'll be using one of those scales in my selections on the dominant chords. One area of great skill of Lenny's was his use of specialty chording. This usually incorporated open strings, intervals of the second, this sort of collision of notes, a good control of modality, understanding the use of chordal harmony as well. So what I'm going to do is take a look at some of the chords that Lenny used, and we're going to organize it much the way that we've been organizing all of the video, which is putting it into progression, putting it to work right away. I'm going to open up with a 2-5-1 in D, but using and taking a close look at some of these specialty chords. This is the big Lenny Breau chord. It's an E minor 11th, and if we look at it for a moment, we've got a root, 5th, 9th, flat 3rd, and there's that beautiful collision of notes. Continuing on, we have a flat 7th and an 11th. Very rich, very big chord, good 2 chord, and a good modal 1 chord as well. I'm going to move to a 5 chord now. This is an A 13th, pretty stock jazz voicing, but we've got the open A in there. And we can play with the 9th. The chord playing across the guitar is root, flat 7th, 9th, 3rd, 13th. Again, functions everything, because Lenny's always playing with the functions. There's the flat 9 instead of the 9th. There's a flat 5. And now a D. Nice D chord that Lenny would use. It's a D major 7-6. We've got root, 3rd, 6th, 7th, and you can put a 9th in if you want. So if we hear that 2-5 again, now this is an altered B, which is really the 6th chord of D. And you can see here, I've got my essential package. I've got a 3rd, which is the D sharp, flat 7th, sharp 9, sharp 5th, root. Nice 6th chord. So from the 2 chord to the 5 chord. And I'm going to use this 6th chord. Using different finger breaks. Lenny, of course, was able to tremolo. Now there I was moving from, again on that altered B sound, normal 9th and a flat 5th, and pushing it into a regular 5th, and then sharpening the 9th and the 5th. So 3 different chords. Once you're comfortable with some of those altered scales that we were discussing, you'll feel a lot stronger, a lot more confident about changing your harmony like that. I'd like to move into the key of C now for a moment and take a look at some of the 2-5-1s that Lenny used in C. Again, with this specialty chord emphasis. Here is certainly one of my favorites. Very tasty chord. He's got the essential tones represented on a split string set, which wasn't uncommon for Lenny. Got the flat third as the F here, and got the C as the flat 7 there. But instead of having a fifth in the chord, he's got an open string G, which is a fourth. Also, A is in the bass, so the fifth is switched to the bass, fourth is put in, and you can pick up that open E string for a ninth. Nice chord. It's also a movable shape. Lovely chord. A lot of times, Lenny uses this 5 chord, which is pretty heavily loaded. If we examine it, we've got the root in the bass, and when you're coming from that D, your bass note is falling. And if we look again further, root, we skip a string, we got F as the flat 7, A flat's the flat 9th, D is the normal 5th. So you can see it's coming from one of those altered environments. And one of the things Lenny could do was move up and down that 9th and also play with the 5th. There I'm raising the 5th, correcting the 5th, and here's a very famous Lenny chord, which is lowering the 5th. So there you've sacrificed your 3rd to get, in effect, a flat 5 chord with a flat 9th, and it's really just the triad D flat placed over a G bass. Another movable shape. Lovely chord. So you can see that this powerful shape lends itself to altering the 5th and also the 9th. If I sharp the 9th there, I'd probably lose the bass note and pick up the 3rd to recapture some of the essential harmony there. Now when I went to the C coming up, a little bit of an unusual C. Here I've got a C major 7th with a sharp 5th. So I've got a root, 3rd, sharp 5th, major 7th, and I'm going to correct that sharp 5th, which is really out, to a 6th or a 5th. So let's hear what that sounds like. Now I'm going to use that 6th chord again, but this time I'm using that triad idea, where I take the flat 5th triad, which is E flat on A, and simply play it against an A bass, open A bass. Now I need to go to a 2 chord now. Another popular Lenny chord, where he's laying down a D minor 9th, root, flat 3rd, flat 7, 9th, and picking up the 4th. Another tonic chord there that's quite nice that Lenny used was the major 9th with root, 3rd, 7th, 9th, and an open E. So he's got a doubled 3rd if you want it. So let me just play through some 2/5s in C there, based on those shapes. On that concluding C, I just simply placed an open G triad, another Lenny move, against the C bass. Now I'd like to move into a minor key so that we can take a look at some of the two chords, or at least a two move that Lenny made, which is quite nice. Now in the key of A minor, your two chord is B minor 7 flat 5 as your normal four-part harmony. And one of the things that now Lenny liked to do to that is, instead of having the flat third in here, he liked to use a ninth. What that does is it changes your scale selection. Normally, that minor 7 flat 5, which is the two chord, will take the Locrian mode. But here, Lenny changes it, and now it's taking a different mode. It's actually acting in the scale of D, melodic minor. Oops. But you get that natural ninth sound, which is a little bit different. So nothing to Lenny to move from the normal third sound, natural ninth sound, and here comes the big 5. And he's able to get the open strings on this one. This one's a killer, and it's E7 with a flat 9 and a sharp 5. And if we analyze it, we've got root, flat 7, flat 9, third, sharp 5th, root again. And then of course we're going to go to that delicious open string A minor that Lenny was so fond of. So let's just hear that again. Now, talking about that 5 for a moment, that heavy 5, chordally and harmonically, it's also an F minor 6th chord, in that you've got your F minor triad, plus a 6th of F, which is D. So a nice way to think there is maybe that this is emanating from that substitute scale we were talking about before, the diminished whole tone. And you can view this as coming from E diminished whole tone, in which case you're really in the key of F melodic minor, so you can be pretty free. Borrowing some triads and using them. Now there, I've got, I'll even make it harsher here. There's an F minor major ninth, and I'm using that instead of the E, and I can flicker between the essential tones. So I really tend to think of that chord as emanating from that diminished whole tone scale. This is a stretch in itself. So we can see, just for a moment there, that this A minor is just your essential package located on your D and G string with some open strings. And it just happens to be that the B is the ninth, E is the 5th, A is the root. There I just converted it to major. So I'd like to do a 2-5-1 in A major here. Pretty popular 2 for Lenny. There you've got a root, you got a flat third, flat 7, ninth, open E, which is the 5th. Sorry, it's the sus on that. And I'm going to use a B flat 7th. Now looking at this B flat for a moment, I'm using a B flat ninth substituting for an E dominant chord. And the reason I can do this is because they're a flat 5th apart and they share the same essential notes. But when you examine it in terms of E, you've got a flat 5th, a flat 7, a third, and and you got a sharp fifth, and you got a flat 9. Now I'd like to just play out a little, just using some of these shapes. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't add a little word about chordal harmony here. And one of the things that Lenny was quite adept at was playing his scales in fourths. And what he did a lot, and I must include this, is he took his essential tones on the middle two strings. For example, the essential tones again of G are A minor, our 2 chord. There's the flat 7 and the flat 3rd. D, essentials, and G. Now what he did, instead of playing in that fashion, is he took his 2 chord and added a 4th underneath. And there's his new 2 chord. It's really just a chordal package emanating from the key of G. And when he went to his 5, he fingered, well, you can finger it various ways, but I'm going to use a finger bend to do this. There's the new essential D, which has the flat 7th, the 3rd, and then the 6th. So he's got movement that's going like this. He's got a 4th on the A, and they're all chordal packages, meaning they're harmonized in fourths. D up a 4th is G, up a 4th is C. But you do have the essential A minor in there. By having these fourths, it creates a new kind of voice leading, which brings us to that chord, a new kind of tonic chord, which in terms of G is 3rd, up a 4th, to an E, which is the 6th, up a 4th to an A, which is the 9th. And you can solidify it with a 5th there. So you've got this wonderful chordal package. So all I'm doing there is I'm going like, this is my chordal D, which is really a D minor 7th sus, my chordal G, which is really a G 13th, and my chordal C, which is really a C 6 9. And I'm just moving down in whole steps. So this is the 2 in C, 5, 1. This is 2 in B flat, 1, 2, 5, 1. So I would be remiss. And all Lenny had done was harmonized his, this is a G major scale. Oops. Extracted and identified his essential tones and gave him a wonderful new 2, 5, 1. I did a workshop with Lenny Breau back in the 80s here in Ottawa, and at that time I asked him what was his personal musical vision, what was he striving for with all these marvelous techniques that he had developed to serve this musical vision. And Lenny described it as he wanted to be a scuba diver underwater with the goggles on and just floating through that wonderful marine life and that sense of quietude that comes from diving underwater. The word he used is quietude, and that's what he was trying to bring to his music. More of creating a kind of sacred place in his music, a quiet place that others could come and draw from. And in that sense, I have, from seeing Lenny perform back at Lehibu in the 70s to doing a workshop with him, he certainly enriched my musical life, and I hope that wherever he is, he's found that quietude.